Welcome to this reading. This is from the book Six Faces of Globalization: Who Wins, Who Loses, and Why It Matters by Anthea Roberts and Nicholas Lamp, published in 2022. In recent years, it has seemed like the world is coming apart at the seams. Many of the apparent certainties of the post-Cold War era lie in tatters. In the West, which is like the USA, Western Europe, Australia, maybe Japan. The West is a confusing term. Sometimes Japan's in the West, sometimes it's not. What appeared to be a broad political consensus on the value of free markets and liberal trade has given way to increasingly acrimonious debates about who wins and who loses from economic globalization. Are Mexican workers stealing US and Canadian jobs? Has the global 1% rigged the game for its benefit? Is China engaged in a stealthy campaign for global supremacy? Are we all bound to lose in a world of untrammeled climate change and deadly pandemics? From the collapse of the Soviet Union until the global financial crisis in 2008, the dominant narrative or story in the West, that is Europe and the United States, highlighted the benefits of economic globalization. When the Cold War ended without shots being fired, the Western model of free market capitalism appeared to have got rid of, all ideological rivals. The end of history was nigh. Gorbachev, after all, a communist, is doing commercials for capitalist Pizza Hut. Pro-market economic reforms swept country after country. Trade and investment treaties were signed, new international institutions were created, and cross-border trade and investment soared. Despite the dizzying pace of change, Western governments and the economic establishment heralded the developments as exciting and positive. Economic liberalization was portrayed as, quote, a rising tide that lifts all boats, quote, a way to grow the pie so that everyone, developed and developing countries, rich and poor, would be better off. An example of a developed country would be Britain, France, or the United States. A developing country might be Nigeria, India, or Colombia, basically places that were in the colonized world. Globalization was seen as an unstoppable but overwhelmingly beneficial force. Free trade was touted as a win-win outcome that would create peace and prosperity for all. To be sure, globalization did not always run smoothly. As the economist Branko Milanovic pointed out in 2003, the prevailing view of globalization represented, quote, only one positive face of globalization, while entirely neglecting the malignant or bad one. Yet episodes such as the Asian financial crisis in 1998 and the Argentinian debt crisis in 2001 were largely treated as bumps in the road, rather than signs that the world economy was on the wrong path. The voices of detractors in the West, such as the protesters who battled police in the streets of Seattle to derail a ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1999, were drowned out as the political and intellectual elites enthusiastically embraced economic globalization. Free trade, globalization, it's good. But this dominant narrative, this story, has come unstuck. In the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis, rival stories about economic globalization began to make significant inroads in the West. Starting in 2011, the Occupy Wall Street protesters popularized the notion of a rift, a breaking between the 1% and the rest of the population. They challenged the idea that the gains from globalization were either trickling down or being redistributed through government action. And they put concerns about inequality firmly on the political agenda. After the 2009 Euro crisis and the arrival of refugees from the Syrian civil war, Europe was rocked by austerity politics, which are responsible economic spending, or lack thereof, that cut welfare to citizens, and fears about Muslim immigration, which led to a hollowing out of centrist political parties in favor of more extreme parties on both the left and the right. The virtues of economic interdependence came under sustained fire in many Western countries, but nowhere more prominently than in the United States and the United Kingdom, that is Great Britain, which have been bastions or strongholds of both economic globalization and neoliberal ideology. That's the idea of free trade. In 2016, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, the EU, as Brexit voters vowed to, quote, take back control over borders and regulations. A few months later, Donald J. Trump was elected president of the United States. Oh boy, Donald Trump is in history now. Great, cool. A few months later, Donald J. Trump was elected president of the United States, having risen to prominence by taking a firm stance against the establishment consensus in favor of free trade and globalization, lambasting the, quote, American carnage of, quote, rusted out factories in manufacturing communities, and decrying the dangers posed by immigrants have been signature elements of Trump's campaign. By the end of 2020, the UK had left the EU, and the United States had charted a new approach to trade on everything from engagement with China to support of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The election of Joe Biden to the US presidency heralded a more moderate approach, but not a return to the old consensus. The sense that the West finds itself in an epochal struggle with China only intensified, while the rise of giant tech corporations with an unprecedented capacity to surveil and manipulate people's actions and beliefs created a lingering sense of dread. And the reality of greater, even potentially catastrophic threats were crystallizing in many people's minds. The devastating impact of climate change, as well as our apparent political inability to do anything meaningful about it, began to hit home as fires swept across Australia, the Amazon, and California. These disasters overlapped with the coronavirus pandemic, which sparked unprecedented disruptions to public life, a severe economic downturn, and growing concerns about the risks posed by global connectivity and economic interdependence. After all, COVID is very much a result of globalization. In sum, political life in Western countries has become more unsettled than at any other time since the end of the Cold War. The centrist consensus, that is agreement, that sustained several decades of economic globalization has frayed. People don't agree about, is globalization good, is it bad? Views that were relegated to the political fringes even a few years ago have found their way into mainstream debates in many countries, and in some cases have come to shape government policy. In many Western democracies, the lines of political battle have not only moved, but also multiplied, as the old division between left and right gives way to multiple vectors of political disagreement. Old alliances are unraveling, and new ones are being formed. Whether and when a new normal will be found, and what its contours might be, remains uncertain. Unscrambling the Rubik's Cube. Here's the Rubik's Cube. It is a confusing time, and our old mental models are increasingly unreliable guides to our complex and evolving reality. We are at a critical juncture. A relatively long period of stability in mainstream thinking about economic globalization has given way to a situation of dramatic flux. During such junctures, narratives, stories, assume particular relevance because they offer new ways for us to understand what the problem is and what should be done about it. Narratives provide the tools to contest the old normal and establish the contours of the new. The authors of this book, we, are scholars of international trade and investment law who follow these debates intently, and the growing multiplicity of arguments about who wins and who loses from economic globalization reminded us of the confusion of a scrambled Rubik's Cube. Here's a Rubik's Cube. You've probably seen it before. The colors were all jumbled up, with each face representing an incoherent and confusing mix of arguments and concerns about trade, inequality, disintegrating communities, corporate power, public health, and environmental catastrophe. Could we unscramble this Rubik's Cube, we wondered? Was there a way to arrange the different colored pieces of the puzzle into coherent narratives, and to fashion a framework to show how these narratives relate to each other? Could this help us to better understand the political moment we found ourselves in, and provide us with tools to analyze potential paths forward? As we disentangle the debates that have been playing out in the Western media, 6 prominent narratives, stories, about the winners and losers from economic globalization emerged, which we conceptualize as existing on the 6 faces of the Rubik's Cube. Here's the top face of the cube. Everybody wins. According to some economists, if you think that globalization impoverishes, makes people poor, countries, and destroys communities, you have it all wrong. Sure, you may have lost your job because workers in other countries are paid less, but that is not all that different from losing your job because workers in the factory next door are more efficient, or because technological progress has rendered your skills obsolete. The market is simply doing its work. You should improve your qualifications to get a better job. In the meantime, you still benefit from globalization since it gives you access to cheaper products made in those other countries. The process of adjustment may be hard at times, but it is a short-term cost that we have to accept in the interest of long-term prosperity. The end result will be a more efficient economy, lower prices, and more abundant consumer choice. In this view, the pushback against economic globalization by people who feel that they have lost out is simply a natural reaction to the creative destruction that necessarily accompanies progress. The appropriate response is to help individuals adjust to the competition unleashed by globalization by offering them retraining and allowing them to share in the gains from trade. Adjustment assistance that eases workers into new jobs not only helps to realize the efficiency gains derived from the reorganization of the International Division of Labor, it's also a political imperative since it shores up public support for international integration. The bottom line is that the economic gains from trade more than suffice to compensate anyone who may have lost out, so that everyone can ultimately benefit from free markets and liberal trade. We call this everybody wins view the establishment narrative, because it was the dominant paradigm for understanding economic globalization in the West in the 3 decades following the end of the Cold War, that is, the 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s. The view reflected a consensus of the main political parties in most Western democracies and beyond, and it has been espoused by many of the institutions that serve as the guardians of the international economic order, such as the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Many powerful actors still endorse this narrative, arguing that free trade not only increases prosperity, but also supports other goals, such as promoting peace. Since the establishment narrative has been ruling the world and also represents the sunniest, that is, the most positive view of globalization, we visualize it as situated at the top of the cube. Let's talk about the 4 sides of the cube, the winners and the losers. So here's the establishment narrative. It's on the top of the cube. Now we're going to talk about the sides of the cube. The establishment narrative now finds itself besieged from all sides. Concerns about the impact of free trade on workers and the environment had bubbled up previously, but discontent with economic globalization tended to be suppressed in mainstream circles in the West. In the decade following the global financial crisis, however, narratives that highlight how economic globalization produces both winners and losers have returned to the center of political debate. These currents have pushed us off the sunny top side of the cube, over the edges, and down to the 4 faces on the cube's sides, as seen in figure 1.2. Instead of relatively limited squabbles between the center left and center right on whether, when, and how to redistribute the gains from trade, we now confront 4 stories, narratives, that present a much more fundamental challenge to the assumptions underlying the establishment perspective. Establishment perspective being like the one that's been around. The establishment narrative looks at the world economy as a whole and treats countries as the relevant actors. It is at these levels and units of analysis that the superior efficiency of a global division of labor, in which every country focuses on its comparative advantage, is most apparent. The narrative emphasizes absolute rather than relative gains, and the metric it employs is economic, typically gross domestic product, or GDP. That's the measurement of the power of an economy. Proponents of the 4 challenger narratives do not necessarily contest that economic globalization has produced absolute economic gains at the aggregate level, whether measured nationally or globally. However, they focus on the distribution of those gains, both within and across countries, and derive much of their energy from challenging the disappointment, fears, and anger of the losers. Where these 4 narratives differ from each other is in which actors they identify as having won or lost, and in why they think it matters. On the left of the political spectrum, we see 2 narratives that emphasize how gains from economic globalization have flowed upward to rich individuals and multinational corporations. The left-wing populist narrative focuses on the ways in which national economies are rigged to channel the gains from globalization to the privileged few. Proponents of this narrative point out that even as countries have seen their GDPs rise, many have also experienced a sharp increase in inequality, with a growing divide between rich and poor and a hollowing out of the middle class. Left-wing populism expresses itself in vertical hostility. Its proponents stand up for the ordinary people who have lost out to the corrupt elite. Whereas some proponents point the finger at chief executive officers, that is CEOs, bankers, and billionaires, the top 1%, others take aim at the educated professional class and the upper middle class more broadly, the top 20%. Wherever the line is drawn, however, left-wing populists agree that the middle class, the working class, and the poor have lost out. Instead of singling out domestic elites, proponents of the corporate power narrative argue that the real winners from economic globalization are multinational corporations, which can take advantage of a global marketplace to produce cheaply, sell everywhere, and pay as little in taxes as possible. These companies use their power to shape international rules in areas that advantage them, such as trade and investment, while lobbying against effective international cooperation on subjects that might disadvantage them, such as taxation. In this way, multinational corporations manipulate the network of domestic and international rules to maximize their profits and minimize their responsibilities. According to the corporate power narrative, economic globalization produces many losers: workers, communities, citizens, even governments, but only one winner: corporations. Although both of these narratives focus on the upward redistribution of wealth, they differ in their emphasis. The left-wing populist narrative zeroes in on domestic problems, highlighting the explosion of inequality within countries. The corporate power narrative, by contrast, adopts a transnational approach and treats multinational corporations and the transnational working class as the key actors. The two narratives are often intertwined in places such as the United States and the United Kingdom, where many on the left are broadly critical of owners of substantial capital, that is, people with a lot of money, whether individual or corporate. In many Western and European countries, by contrast, where levels of domestic inequality are lower, the corporate power narrative features more prominently, as was evident in the protests across Europe in 2015 and 2016 against the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP. On the right of the political spectrum, we find two narratives about winners and losers that primarily see the gains from globalization flowing sideways to foreigners and foreign countries. In the right-wing populist narrative, workers, their families, and their communities lose from globalization, both economically and in a cultural sense. This narrative's emphasis varies in different countries. In the United States, with the loss of blue-collar, that is like working-class jobs in manufacturing, the loss of blue-collar jobs to China and Mexico has devastated manufacturing communities. The narrative has a strong anti-trade element. In Western Europe, anti-immigrant sentiment and concerns about a loss of sovereignty, of control over your own country, are central features of the narrative, whereas anxieties about the impact of international trade are less pronounced. In the United Kingdom, Britain, for instance, many of those who voted for Brexit did not oppose free trade. They rebelled against what they perceived as dictates from the EU institutions in Brussels and longed to regain control over immigration. The right-wing populist narrative shares with the left-wing version a deep distrust of elites, but the two narratives part company on who they blame and what they blame the elite for. Whereas left-wing populists fault the elite for enriching themselves at the expense of the working and middle classes, right-wing populists denounce the elite for failing to protect the hard-working native population from threats posed by an external other. The right-wing populist narrative thus has a strong horizontal us versus them quality, whether expressed through concern about protecting workers from the offshoring of jobs or guarding them against an inflow of immigrants who might compete for those jobs, live off the welfare system, or threaten the native community's sense of identity. The right-wing populist narrative also highlights geographical divisions within countries. such as the diverging fortunes of thriving cities and declining rural areas. For proponents of the narrative, these geographical divides map onto different value systems. Rural areas are bastions, strongholds, fortresses for conservative cultural values such as stability, tradition, patriotism, and loyalty. That's why when you go out to the countryside, you see a lot more Trump flags. Whereas urban centers, such as San Francisco, represent an untethered and amoral, quote, globalism. For proponents of the narrative, these cultural cleavages are more significant than divisions based on class or income, per se. The geoeconomic narrative also focuses on an external threat, but of a different kind. It emphasizes economic and technological competition between the United States and China as great power rivals. Although both countries have gained from economic globalization in absolute terms, in relative terms, China has closed the gap on America. Concerns about the interplay of economic security and national security have waxed and waned over the years. The United States treated the Soviet Union as a security threat during the Cold War, and Japan as an economic competitor during the 70s and 80s. But the United States increasingly perceives China as both an economic competitor and a security threat, lending the geoeconomic narrative an urgency that it did not have during the Cold War. Although the narrative features most prominently in America, it is gaining ground in other Western countries as well, where China is increasingly regarded as a strategic competitor and a potential security threat rather than merely as an economic partner. Instead of applauding trade and investment as enhancing economic welfare and increasing prospects for peace, the geoeconomic narrative emphasizes the security vulnerabilities created by economic interdependence and digital connectivity with a strategic rival. So basically, if the United States relies on China, maybe that's not so good because the United States doesn't like China. Although both the right-wing populist and geoeconomic narratives emphasize external, horizontal threats, they differ in key ways. The former focuses on cultural as well as economic losses, while the latter is more mindful of relative economic power of countries and its capacity to undergird political and military power. The former primarily laments, or is sad about, the loss of the manufacturing jobs of the past, while the latter focuses on winning the race in the technologies of the future, such as fifth-generation 5G networks and artificial intelligence. AI. Yikes. And the former targets Polish plumbers who undercut local workers, whereas the latter casts a critical eye on Chinese scientists and engineers who might steal Western technology. Okay, so we have this cube. We've talked about the top of the cube. That's the establishment narrative. We talked about the sides of the cube, right-wing populist, left-wing populist, geoeconomic, corporate power. And lastly, the last part of the cube is the global threat narrative. The bottom face of the cube, everybody loses. The narratives we have discussed so far assume either that everyone wins from economic globalization, the top face, or that the economic globalization produces both winners and losers, the four faces on the sides. By contrast, on the bottom face of the Rubik's Cube, we locate narratives that see all of us at risk of losing from economic globalization in its current form. These narratives, these stories, portray economic globalization as a source and accelerator of global threats, such as pandemics and climate change. Some of these narratives focus on how global connectivity increases the risk of contagion, both of the viral and economic kind. After all, in January of 2020, I got on an airplane at Pudong International Airport in the city of Shanghai and flew to the city of Chicago, O'Hare International Airport. Direct flight, very easy. Yeah, it was January 23rd, 2020. On that flight, people, not me, at least I don't think so, were infected with the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. That was one way that pandemic spread. Others warrant that the skyrocketing carbon emissions of that airplane, associated with the global diffusion of Western patterns of production and consumption, are endangering both people and planet. These global threats narratives emphasize our common humanity. Their proponents call for global solidarity and international cooperation in the face of common challenges. The United States and China need to work together to combat climate change, these people would say. Proponents of the global threats narratives start from the observation that everything is interdependent. Our economic systems are located within our social and political systems, which in turn are embedded within our environmental ecosystems and planetary boundaries. According to these narratives, we need to redefine the goals of our economies to enable individuals and societies to survive and thrive within the limits of our planet. This can mean emphasizing resilience over efficiency in our supply chains and sustainability over profit-seeking in our economies. Unless we fashion a more sustainable and resilient global economy, they warn, we run the risk that everybody will lose. We will not lose equally, however. Some people and some countries will suffer first or worst. Proponents of these narratives argue that we need to be attentive to these distributional questions, either for moral reasons, because we have an obligation to look out for those who are most vulnerable, or for instrumental reasons, because no one will be safe until everyone is safe. Globalization through the kaleidoscope. I should have put a picture of a kaleidoscope on here. Kaleidoscope is like you look into it and then there's like a whole bunch of pretty images. It's kind of crazy. I don't know. You probably haven't used a kaleidoscope. I should have put a picture. Dang. Debates about economic globalization often revolve around the question of whether particular narratives about who wins and who loses are right or wrong. That's not the question we seek to answer. We will not tell you what to think about economic globalization. Instead, we will try to show you how we can think about the current controversies over economic globalization in productive ways. Narratives provide the storylines through which we perceive and communicate our understanding of reality and express our values. We tell stories. That's what makes us human, perhaps. Political scientists and policy analysts have long recognized that narratives not only reflect and affect our understanding of reality, but also shape our actions. The stories we tell matter. Recent attention to narratives among prominent economists is particularly striking. For John Kay and Mervyn King, narratives are the most powerful mechanism available for organizing our imperfect knowledge in conditions of radical uncertainty. In a complex world, narratives are necessary to help answer the question, what is going on here? Meanwhile, Danny Roderick has argued that economic and cultural narratives are crucial to understanding the populist backlash against globalization, since they provide direction and content to the economic grievances caused by globalization. We construct the narratives that we present in this book from statements by politicians, journalists, academics, and citizens. They appear in various guises in our newspapers, magazines, books, and TV shows, on social media, and in personal conversations, as showcased in Figure 1.4, the narratives reflected in the covers of The Economist. So this is The Economist. It's a British magazine about economics. And here are all the different stories that we can tell about globalization. Maybe we can tell even more than just these 6, certainly. But these are the same magazine talking about all these different stories. So here's the establishment on the up, the world's economy, surprising rise. All economies are going up here. US, the EU, India, Brazil, Japan, China, and the UK. This one is the left-wing populist narrative, the rich and the rest, a 14-page special report on the global elite. Hey, saying that inequality is a big problem. The right-wing populist narrative is here, left behind, how to help places hurt by globalization. Look at this rusted-out town, somebody down on his luck, a railroad crossing, the factories are closed. You might have been to these places. They're all over the United States. Here's the corporate power narrative. Winners take all. Why high profits are a problem for America. The corporations are making all the money. The other people are not making the money. That's bad. China versus America, a dangerous rivalry. And you've got the U.S. eagle and the Chinese dragon. That's the geoeconomic narrative, saying, hey, kind of entering perhaps a new Cold War with globalization. And lastly, we've got the global threats narrative. In the line of fire, losing the war against climate change. These are covers from The Economist from 2017, 2011, 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2018. So all pretty recent. Although some of the narratives have been strongly shaped by specific actors, they lie beyond the control of any particular actor, as anyone can employ the framing and analytical moves of a narrative. Right-wing populism lives on past Donald Trump's presidency, for instance, just as left-wing populism continued to thrive after Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders conceded the U.S. Democratic primary. None of our narratives can be attributed to a single author. And even someone whom we identify as a proponent of a certain narrative may not subscribe to all its elements. The same actor may embrace multiple narratives or different narratives in different settings. Our approach is informed by the conviction that when dealing with contested issues, such as globalization, it is crucial to explore multiple perspectives. No single story can capture the multifaceted nature of such issues, and no perspective is neutral. Each narrative distills a certain set of experiences and tells part of the story. None tells the whole. Each narrative embodies value judgments about what merits our attention and how we should evaluate what we see. None is value-free. In the economist Milanovich's words, globalization, quote, presents different faces to different people. Depending on where we live, whether we are rich or poor, where we stand ideologically, we are bound to see the process differently. Considering multiple narratives in a structured way allows us to be conscious of how our approach fits within the broader discursive universe, and what others might be seeing and valuing that we might be missing. It forces us to take in the many faces of economic globalization. We live in highly polarized times. In many Western countries, the electorate is becoming more divided, and individuals are growing more distrustful of those holding different political views. People are increasingly sorting themselves geographically so that they are more likely to live and work with others who have similar backgrounds. Cable television and social media have encouraged the development of echo chambers that reinforce existing views, even as they stigmatize and delegitimize alternative viewpoints. Our political discussions are rife with condensation and contempt. Sometimes we treat others as though they were too stupid to understand the facts or their own interests, or too self-interested, selfish, to care about the well-being of anyone other than themselves. At a critical juncture, when we need to have an open debate about the path forward, we have instead adopted some very bad habits in how we engage with one another. We believe that taking an empathetic approach is the first step in overcoming polarization and facilitating constructive disagreement. As social psychologist Jonathan Haidt explains, quote, if you really want to change someone's mind on a moral or political matter, you'll need to see things from that person's angle as well as from your own. And if you truly see it the other person's way, deeply and intuitively, you might even find your own mind opening in response. Empathy is an antidote to righteousness. Helping readers achieve that sort of cognitive empathy, where you understand another approach from within its own frame of reference, whether you agree with it or not, is a key purpose of this book. We focus primarily on the narratives that have become salient, powerful, in Western countries, particularly in the US and UK, where the pushback against economic globalization has been the most forceful. The 6 faces of globalization that get the most of the attention in Western debates also have blind spots and biases, a point we highlight by examining additional perspectives from outside the West. Although the Rubik's Cube narratives enjoy some currency around the world, other narratives that better reflect the distinctive historical experience and current positionality of countries outside the West are often more prominent. These tend to receive only passing attention in Western debates, and sometimes run counter to dominant Western perceptions. To convey a sense of some of these alternative storylines, we sketch 4 additional narrative strands: the neo-colonial narrative, various Asia Rising narratives, narratives against Western hegemony, and a left-behind narrative. Understanding these narratives, an undertaking to which this book can only make a minor contribution, is indispensable for anyone trying to comprehend truly global issues. We explore how we can use multiple narratives to understand other multifaceted and evolving phenomena, including climate change and the coronavirus pandemic. Viewing these phenomena through multiple lenses allows us to blend the insights of different narratives and to appreciate these phenomena in their kaleidoscopic complexity. All right, I guess we'll just maybe Google what a kaleidoscope is. There we go. Apparently Netflix has a show about kaleidoscopes. This is the kaleidoscope. Whoa. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. See, it's a complex shape. You got to see it from a whole bunch of different angles. This method bears a closer resemblance to turning a kaleidoscope than to solving a Rubik's Cube. With each turn, the colored pieces shift, new reflections are created, and new patterns appear. But there's no end to the process and no single solution to the problem. Trump's defeat, for now, has revived optimism among some commentators about a reset on economic globalization. But few expect a wholesale return to free market liberalism that had led to the explosion of trade and investment flows during the 90s and 2000s. Any attempt to define a new normal will need to be sensitive to the critiques we describe and to the ways in which the world has changed since the high point of economic globalization following the Cold War. President Biden's trade agenda reflects this insight. It embraces the establishment narrative's enthusiasm for trade's potential to generate prosperity, while tempering it with a commitment to prioritizing the welfare of U.S. workers, a concern of both right-wing and left-wing populists. An awareness of the need for greater regulation of corporate power, including in the areas of taxation and antitrust, and a determination to compete aggressively with China, economically and technologically, while cooperating on global threats such as climate change and pandemics. In the penultimate, the last chapter of the book, we explore the potential for similar combinations of narratives in relation to the role of work and workers in society, international economic independence, and policy responses to climate change. Ultimately, this book offers a meta-framework for understanding Western debates about economic globalization and a kaleidoscopic method for identifying disagreements, as well as common themes and potential alliances among various narratives. The book also showcases a method, looking at complex issues through a kaleidoscope, that can serve us well in examining other contentious political debates and policy challenges, from pandemics to the climate crisis. We hope that this approach will enable us to understand not only where we have come apart, but also how we might come back together. So, which narrative out of the 6, which story about globalization makes the most sense to you? What story do you like best, or which one do you think is the most true? To help you understand these stories, there is a Rubik's Cube that you can cut out and then glue or tape together to show the different stories. There's the establishment narrative. Everybody wins, both developing countries and developed countries. There's the left-wing narrative. There's the corporate power narrative and the right-wing narrative and the competition with China narrative. And there's the global threats narrative. And then you'll have a cube that you can bring to our discussion in class. It's an art project, I suppose. If you have actually read this reading, congratulations. You'll be able to showcase your economic prowess by cutting out this cube, using glue or tape to build it, and bringing it to the discussion. Use this cube to help understand the different stories we tell about the impacts of globalization. And here's the key: absolute gains and relative gains. You can figure that out. Alrighty, thanks for listening. This is complicated stuff, but it's really important in understanding the modern world. Thanks a lot. Have a good one. Bye-bye.